From B Media Production, this is B Podcasting. Engage your audience with audio communication.
Hi and welcome to episode 2. I'm Nick Schildberger, Managing Director of B Media Production. This podcast series is all about exploring the huge opportunities offered by podcasts, in particular to companies looking to engage with their audience and grow their brand. We talk to the most influential podcast experts around. Coming up on this episode, we speak to Nick Qua, a leading commentator and industry insider on podcasting in the United States, who brings us his thoughts on why podcasting resonates with listeners and brands. But first, let me introduce my co-host and podcast aficionado, Chris Ashmore.
Hello, Nick. Well, before we start, can I say that I've finally gotten around to listening to Missing Richard Simmons. For those who don't know, it's probably one of the most anticipated and promoted podcasts since perhaps Serial days. And except for the last episode, I got to say I thoroughly enjoyed this podcast series. Absolutely loved it.
Yeah, I loved it too. It was brilliant, wasn't it? Absolutely great production quality, something all podcasters should aspire to, and a really interesting and well-told story about that sudden disappearance of Richard Simmons back in 2014, although not really a literal disappearance because we know where he is. He's just retreated from public life. You would have seen that the podcast has come under a little bit of criticism since the final episode a few weeks ago, with Richard's manager coming out and saying it's a bit of an invasion of his privacy. So I think today we'll steer clear of the content, but I would like to just talk about the hype that you mentioned around the marketing that preceded its launch, because that pre-launch build-up was done really well, wasn't it?
Well, it was. There was a lot of build-up in the newspapers and a lot of build-up in traditional media, not just within the circles of the podcasting world. So they managed to get the message out quite early, which resulted in quite high numbers from the very first episode.
Yeah, it just goes to show that marketing and PR prior to a podcast being launched is so important. I also found it really interesting that this podcast was promoted and released a week earlier on Stitcher Premium. What's the plan behind that?
Well, I suppose it allows them to get some more traction with advertising dollars or extra revenue. Stitcher, it's a listening platform for podcasts and audio content where, consumers can listen to what is on there for free. Stitcher Premium, that's a paid thing. So for members, they get extra offerings from Stitcher, which include the same podcasts but without the ads for that uninterrupted experience. They get original shows that's only available on Stitcher's premium service. They get bonus episodes from other podcasts like WTF with Mark Maron, and they get early access to new episodes, exactly what Missing Richard Simmons provided. So that's how that fitted in. So the producers, Pineapple Street, must have obviously done a deal with Stitcher to offer it a week early to the premium subscribers.
So in that case, the content was exactly the same on Stitcher Premium as it was on iTunes and other places later, was it?
Yes, so for the hardcore fans who couldn't get enough of Missing Richard Simmons, I suppose that was an enticement for them to sign up to Stitcher Premium to get the goss before, everybody else.
There's no doubt there's so much good material being produced from the US. So who better to talk to about the US scene than Nick Qua? And I believe you caught up with him.
Well, that's right. It's worth examining the current state of play in the US as it indicates what's to come here. And Nick's weekly newsletter is the go-to read for thousands of producers and commercial players in the podcast space in the United States and around the world. It's called Hot Pod, and there's a members-only version called Hot Pod Pro with extra juicy details for the hardcore fans. And I'm very pleased to speak with Nick Qua on his thoughts of the podcasting industry in general and our own levels of participation here in Australia. And he's quite positive on the state of things here, by the way. First, I ask him why podcasts are so special and so enjoyable.
I find that the form of oral storytelling to be something that's a lot more emotionally resonant. It kind of provides a deeper sense of authenticity when you're consuming whatever the story is being told, whether it's a story or whether it's a conversation. There's a sense that it draws you into the experience in a way that is a lot more just rich in its experience. But podcasting specifically as a specific form of audio programming, I think the fact that it's on demand, it's also a big part of that consumption experience. You choose to listen to a conversation about politics. You choose to listen to a story about whatever comes on 99% Invisible or Reply All or whatever. You've made the explicit choice to create the space for yourself. It sort of goes into your ears, through your earphones, into your eardrums. That is a very special place that you created for yourself. And I think that's a big part of the psychological value and emotional value of consuming podcasts. But I'm sure there's a huge theory of aesthetics here somewhere, but I just don't have the language to speak that.
Right. Well, it seems that the industry has really gone gangbusters in the last 12 or 18 months. How big is this industry now as a business in the US, and how much bigger will it likely become?
I think it's a little hard to quantify in terms of the dollar value that's currently flowing through the industry at large. The proxy that I sort of really hinge much of my analysis around is this number that was established by the Edison Research Group in their annual Infinite Dial report, placing the number of monthly active podcast listeners to about 57 to 60 million. And that was a number that was released last summer. And in terms of the dollar value of how big the industry is, in terms of the amount of advertising money that's flowing through the space, I've seen estimates that project it to hit 200 million in the US alone over the next 2 years. Right now, it's quite a bit smaller than that because it's still very much trying to find its base and trying to sort of develop deeper relationships with the advertising industry and agencies. But my personal estimate puts it somewhere around slightly under 100 million at this point. But that is based on, it's a singular source kind of stuff. And I'd wait until like a much more firm analysis is put out. And I'm not capable to do that. Which is all to say, it's relatively small compared to radio, which is in the billions. But I do believe it'll become much bigger over time, largely if you just sort of notice the parallels of what happened in video and what happened in print, especially. This notion of digital on-demand modes of distribution very much taking the place and inching into the primary modes of consumption for most readers, listeners, viewers, and at some point taking over and pushing broadcast into a much more niche position.
So is it fair to say that technology is really holding it back to be a bigger industry?
I think a little bit of technology, a little bit of sort of awareness, and a lot of just what it takes to cultivate a new set of user behaviors, right? It took a while for people to get used to the idea of Facebook. It just took a couple of years for people to get familiar and comfortable with this environment and have that be centralized within their experience. It took a couple of years for people to start reading newspaper articles on the internet. There is a certain sort of natural friction that happens, but it is also very much the somewhat counterintuitive or somewhat strenuous process of subscribing to a podcast and, finding a podcast. It's a lot of design challenges and technical barriers that still prevent mass consumption. But that very much is going to change when, the whole notion of audio being everywhere becomes fully literalized. And I think we're beginning to see that with these sort of nascent conversations about, stuff like the Amazon Echo, stuff like the Alexa platform sort of existing in the broader network of the Internet of Things, which is the notion of digitized everything. Any object can be essentially digital and hooked to the Internet. And if any object can be hooked to the Internet, it could also have a speaker attached to it. And there you have an entire modality in which you could consume audio. And so there's a path that we can see forward, and there's also paths that we do not quite know how to imagine, but they will reveal themselves over time.
Well, it's also been said, and I'm not sure what your thoughts are on this, that until big brands fully embrace podcasting, or when big brands fully embrace podcasting, the industry will then really start to take off. Has that happened yet in the US, or is that likely to happen sometime soon?
I've heard arguments, certainly from the bigger companies in the space, that it has already happened. Because I think the notion of bigger advertisers buying into it and therefore sort of accelerating a space, right? Like we have to sort of also notice the drumbeat and timelines of these bigger companies. They schedule ad buys very much on a not just quarterly but almost yearly basis. There's like a larger infrastructural thinking within big advertisers and big companies when it comes to sort of adjusting and making choices with the advertising budgets. So my sources in the much bigger podcast companies in the space have already committed a significant number of dollars from a significant number of quote unquote bigger advertisers. The question is like how much injection and how much acceleration is that going to sort of introduce into the growth of the industry. Personally, from a much more macro perspective, I feel like the era of big brands swooping into a space and helping blow out a digital media channel is a little bit over, because I think the hype for digital as a broad category has died out. Now everybody's kind of a little bit smarter about the promises of digital. We were a bit smarter about the failures of digital in a lot of ways. And then we also have to consider the sort of larger factor of there being Facebook and Google essentially eating up the majority of digital ad budgets. And so the question is for podcasting, how it can sort of build its message as a niche or as a specific value add in terms of an advertising choice. And I think very much embedded into why podcast programming is very valuable compared to other kinds of digital programming. I think the value proposition is there. It's up to the companies to make those arguments in a way that works.
Why is it valuable to advertisers? We hear that podcasting is more intimate and listeners listen to those advertisements compared to other media, but why do you think podcasts are an attractive medium on which to advertise?
For me, I think it's hooked on two major points. One is this notion that you have not only a captive audience, you have an audience that explicitly chose to consume the thing. This is a space in which the audience is ripe for an interaction with the advertiser. They will listen to, an hour-long conversation that's very compelling, and, they would sort of stumble into the advertising experiences in a way that's meaningful to them. The second thing is a little bit more, is also embedded to this notion of intimacy. The role of the host and the role of the narrator and the role of the voice is huge in the experience of podcast programming in general. And the sort of endorsement model, right? The whole thing that I think media is struggling with right now is this notion of trust and the notion of a relationship with the media source. And I think within podcasting, the existence of trust is particularly strong between listener and creator. And I think that is something that is valuable to advertisers.
If we can talk about monetization, very few are making money from podcasting in Australia, it seems, but who's making money from this in the US and what kind of companies?
I would largely break this out into three categories. One, there is now a very firm collection of maturing podcast companies, like they're podcast-only companies. These are companies like Gimlet, like Midroll Media, like Panoply, like Wondery, that exist solely as a venture within the podcasting space, and they're making quite a bit of money. I think there's been a report out from a fellow contributor at Neiman Lab, which is a journalism innovation blog that syndicates my newsletter, that has found the majority of these companies are bringing in tens of millions of dollars per company with respect to budgets, and are creating shows that are generating quite a bit of revenue. So that's that particular class of companies, and I think they're only going to grow and get stronger over time. They're going to make a bunch of mistakes, but which company doesn't? The second category is this sort of something that's unique to the US, and I think that's it kind of drives a lot of the growth and development and innovation here, that in ways that you don't quite see in any other country, which is the public radio system that we have in the US. NPR, WNYC, WBEZ, these places have a strong broadcast base. And as a consequence of that, they have strong audiences around their podcasts. And a lot of them have taken to developing shows specifically for podcasts. And my understanding is that those programming have driven a great deal of the digital revenue growth that these stations are seeing. There was a report out recently that over half of digital revenue growth in 2016 for NPR and a bunch of these stations was driven by podcasts. And I think that is significant. Finally, you have not a lot, but a collection of independent podcasters that are doing quite well. They are sort of making money within the range that they're able to. I would sort of counsel people to sort of think of them in the same way that you would think of sort of almost like a premium cable TV show or like an independent film. They're sort of generating money based on an economics that looks a lot like that. However, the number of those operators are fairly small. There's people like, Tim Ferriss is one that you might consider a person who works in this paradigm. In a lot of ways, the Night Vale people, Welcome to Night Vale, operates in that paradigm. You could still argue that a bunch of the shows within the Radiotopia umbrella works within that paradigm. And, for me, that is the more interesting place to watch, and the way that that collection of creators interacts with these larger podcast companies and how they're both able to make money over time in different ways. That, for me, is the big question and the thing that I'm thinking about.
Do you take notice of events in podcasting here in Australia? And if so, how do you see our market shaping up compared to the US?
I have been paying quite a bit of attention to Australia. A number of people who read HotPod, a good portion comes from Australia, and therefore I get a lot of inbounds and press releases and people asking questions. I do think things are shaping up pretty slowly in Australia compared to the US, and I kind of chalk it up to two things. One, I feel like Australia, much like the UK, has a sort of very large public broadcasting entity that in a lot of ways defines the space and defines the ability and the volume of production. And I think the absence of competition within that system is also a big part of why the development and innovations in podcasts, they tend to happen slowly when there is one big entity in the space. And I think also the absence of a private market, which is, I think it's basically close to non-existent. There are a bunch of independent creators that are publishing podcasts, but there is no infrastructure that is trying to help them make money or help them figure out an audience. And how to fix that, the question there is tied very much to the very fundamentals of how do you create a market. And I think you need the development of like a handful of risk-friendly capitalists to try to go out there and build some companies and try to take a few hits and develop some relationships that the ABC can't. And absent that, I don't see any sort of quick path forward for growth. I think it'll just continue growing slowly unless you see dynamics in any of these two fronts.
Mm-hmm. What podcasts do you listen to? What are you interested in?
Oh my God, I listen to, it's part of my job, so I listen to way too much. I largely break my day down to podcasts that are like in my primary rotation and podcasts that I have to like try out and seek out, because you always want to be on the lookout for what might end up being the next big thing. But stuff that I sort of willingly listen to, it's a combination of, I'm very much a person that's interested in news and politics, and I think about that a lot. So a good chunk of my time is spent listening to a bunch of political podcasts and news podcasts and podcasts about news and the media. That's a big part of my diet. I also listen to the staples, the standards. This American Life remains the strongest team in radio in America and podcasting. And also I listen to it a lot of like chatty conversationals. I'm a huge fan of the shows that are put out by The Ringer, which is a network and a digital media company started by Bill Simmons, who's this interesting sports like writer person in the US. And I'm also like on the lookout. I particularly take interest in storytelling podcasts because I think real interesting creative fiction work and narrative work can happen in this space. And it's baffling to me that it hasn't flourished in a way until now. Yeah, so I listen to almost everything. But something I actually don't listen to very much actually is comedy podcasts, and that's largely because I'm a bit of a grim person.
Well, you were spoilt for political podcasts last year with the American election. There was a plethora of all different sizes and types. Are there still Donald Trump's love him or loathe him, but you can't say that he's not interesting. So there's probably going to be quite a lot more political podcasts for you to listen to during the next 4 years at least anyway.
Yeah, I actually wrote a column about this for Vulture the other day. I do think that we're still in the post-election slump because A, people are tired, and B, for a good number of podcast listeners who do tend to swing liberal, therefore away from Trump, it's a bit horrifying right now to sort of let that kind of news very closely, intimately into your life. But I do think we are moving into a space where political podcasts are really going to flourish, because I think political journalism and media across the board now, it's going to be on fire. Like this is, America might have not been as politically engaged as it was before. Now it kind of has no choice. And we're definitely going to see that. And I do have a strong feeling that activistic podcasts or political podcasts that are grounded in the sense of activism will be a genre to watch. I think that's something that's going to likely blow up. But yeah, that's just sort of my quick read on the matter.
Well, final question, Nick. For someone starting their own podcast, what advice would you give to make a good one?
I'll say three things. I can't quite give advice on what makes a good podcast, because if there's anything that I've learned from working on the internet for a while, it's good is on the eye of the beholder, and there is a niche for everything and everybody. And so, that should be hopeful for a lot of people. But the first thing I'll say is that on a very fundamental level, you need to have good equipment. Like, no matter how good your story might be, no matter what you produce, the game is always to lower the amount of friction that listeners will have when they try to consume your podcast. And so the very basic thing that can be easily fixed is just like having relatively good audio quality. That goes a long way. And that should be true for everybody. Everybody should be concerned about that. The second thing I'll say is give yourself a good runway. Give yourself 6 months to a year, and just tell yourself when you're starting out, I'm just going to do this for 6 months or for a year. And no matter what happens, even if it doesn't grow, or even if it grows like a lot, but not in a way that I like it to, I'm just going to do it for a year, because you don't really know what's going to happen. And you need to give yourself enough runway to find what you're trying to do and what your voice is and where you're coming from.
That's podcast expert Nick Qua. If you'd like to check out his Hot Pod newsletter, go to hotpodnews.com.
For me, Nick puts into perspective a few things that keep coming up in discussions about podcasting as an industry. We often hear that when compared to other media, podcast listenership is still insignificant, by the numbers anyway, but it's that on-demand nature of podcasts that means people are choosing to listen, and therefore listeners are fully engaged.
Well, that's right. It's like radio or music or even the television. It's there in the background as you're doing other things. You're not really paying close attention to those media, whereas podcasting, the barriers to finding a podcast you want to listen to and then going through the technical difficulties of accessing that podcast, there's real hurdles to get to listen to what you want to listen to. And that in itself shows that people are really wanting to pay attention once they get there.
Nick's point about the intimate relationship between host and listener is also so important. Trust is more quickly developed than through other forms of media, he says. So that's got to be huge for brands that are advertising. It's like James Cridland said in episode 1, it's similar to word-of-mouth advertising, and we know how powerful that is. You've got the full attention of a listener and the chance to talk to them. So next episode, we stick closer to home and talk to 2 sets of local podcasters that are making a living from podcasting. Have you got a sneak peek for us, Chris?
Yes, so I was able to speak with 2 independent Australian podcasters that are actually making money from podcasting outside of advertising or sponsorship. And how they're doing it is by tapping into a successful money-generating model of podcasting. The success didn't happen overnight. It was a long and hard slog into building communities who just can't get enough of their respective ways of storytelling. One is Cameron Riley, who started the Life of Caesar podcast as a bit of a lark until the numbers just grew and grew. It's one of several podcasts in his portfolio of the Podcast Network, or TPM as he calls it, and he shares his tips on how to get a bigger number of listeners. And here's a snippet.
The best place to pick up new listeners is the iTunes podcast directory. You want to get coverage as much as you can in the new and noteworthy section of iTunes. How to get into that is still a bit of a black box mystery. But I also decided that one of the most important things was the star rating that the podcast had in iTunes and the number of positive reviews that it had in iTunes.
That's Cameron Riley. The other podcast, perhaps Australia's most commercially successful independent podcast, Benjamin Grundy and Aaron Wright's seriously entertaining Mysterious Universe, which currently commands around 1 million downloads a month. Yes, that's right, 1 million downloads a month to their free weekly podcast. But that's not how they're making serious money. They're making it from the premium subscribers who pay $9 a month for extra content.
What you do is you produce a service and people have the option to pay for it. They exchange money for that service. And that's the way that you make money.
If we tried to live off our advertising revenue alone, it wouldn't be possible. It's not even close.
No.
The only way we've been able to run a business is from subscription payments. And this is a strategy that is being missed by the industry for what I don't know the reason though. Maybe it's a technical thing. Maybe it's just the way that people think they'll be successful.
That's Ben Grundy and Aaron Wright from Mysterious Universe. Next episode, we take a look at podcasters making a living from their craft and the loyalty from their fans, mostly overseas, happy to pay for each episode.
And thanks to you, Chris, I'm also now a huge fan of Mysterious Universe. I never thought their crazy stories would capture me, but there you go, and I can't wait to hear from Ben and Aaron. So that you don't miss out on all that's coming up, why not subscribe to Be Podcasting in iTunes? And if you found this valuable, we'd love you to leave a review. That ends episode 2 of Be Podcasting. From all of us at Be Media Production, thanks so much for listening.
Be Podcasting is produced by the team at Be Media Production. Managing Director Nick Schildberger, Executive Producer Heather Dawson, Producer Chris Ashmore, and I'm Peter Letts, Director of Audio. For more about us, go to be.com.au.